What if the most terrifying ghost in someone's life is your silence? Not your anger, not your retaliation, not the explosion they expected, but your absence, your stillness, your refusal to play the game anymore. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were disappearing in a relationship? Like your pain was a stage they performed on, your tears were applause to their cruelty? Have you ever begged someone to understand you, only to realize they never wanted to understand in the first place? You give, and they take. You explain, and they twist. You stay, and somehow you still feel abandoned. You start to ask questions no one around you seems to want to hear. Am I being too sensitive? Maybe it is my fault. Why do I always end up being the one who hurts more? But what if the answer has never been about being too emotional or not enough? What if your sensitivity wasn't a weakness, but a mirror? And what if, stay with me, your presence once gave them power, but your absence will haunt them forever? Carl Jung said something most people forget. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But what happens when someone refuses to understand themselves? When all they do is project what they cannot face within onto the people who love them the most? That's the world of the narcissist. They don't want you to heal. They want you reactive, confused, and dependent. Because if you start looking within, the illusion they built begins to crumble. But here's what Jung understood better than anyone. The moment you stop being their mirror, you become their nightmare. When you begin the journey inward, toward your own truth, your own worth, your individuation, you don't just walk away, you become untouchable. This video isn't about demonizing narcissists. It's not about revenge. It's not even about them. It's about you. It's about finally understanding why you were targeted, why your empathy was exploited, and how the very traits that made you vulnerable are also the source of your deepest power. Because the greatest transformation, as Jung revealed, doesn't come from escaping the shadow, but by turning to face it. So if you've ever been made to feel like you were too much, too soft, too emotional, if you've ever felt invisible in the presence of someone who claimed to love you, if you've ever wondered whether you'll ever reclaim your strength, then stay. Not for them, for you. Because by the end of this, you won't just understand what happened to you, you'll understand who you're becoming. And that, my friend, is where the haunting begins. When someone throws accusations at you, unfounded, relentless, always with the same bitter edge, have you ever paused and asked yourself, is this truly about me? Or is this their wound speaking through me? Carl Jung called this phenomenon projection. The unconscious act of casting one's disowned feelings, thoughts, and darkness onto another. And no one masters this mechanism quite like the narcissist. What you feel is real. The confusion, the shame, the need to defend yourself over and over again. It's not your weakness. It's the result of being turned into a mirror, not a person, but a surface onto which someone else throws the parts of themselves they can't bear to face. They see your sensitivity and call it weakness. They feel threatened by your intuition and label it paranoia. They hurl blame and chaos toward you and make you apologize for the storm they created. But the most terrifying moment for them isn't your anger, it's your silence. Because when you stop reacting, you stop reflecting. When you no longer defend, explain, argue, or cry, the game collapses. Narcissists need your emotional reaction like oxygen. Jung called this a psychological energy exchange, where your pain becomes their nourishment. But when the mirror goes still, when the emotional dance ends, they're forced to face the one thing they've always avoided, their own shadow. And that's the part they cannot handle. Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But the narcissist refuses this wisdom. They don't seek understanding. They seek control, and they use projection as their weapon of choice. So what happens when you take that weapon away? When you no longer play your role in their drama, you become something they can't define, An unmovable silence, a stillness that reflects nothing back, a void that offers no more emotional supply. And that void, it terrifies them, because it forces them to reckon with the truth. Without your reaction, they have no power. In your silence, something begins to awaken, not rage, not revenge, but sovereignty. You're no longer trapped in the mirror they held up to you. You become unseen, not invisible, but unavailable, not broken, but intact. This is the beginning of a transformation far deeper than escape. It's the emergence of your authentic self. Are you ready to step into that self? Calm, aware, untouchable. Then let's go deeper. There comes a moment, not loud, not violent, but so quietly earth-shaking it splits the soul from its false anchors, when you stop asking, "What do they think of me?" and start whispering, "What do I know of myself?" Carl Jung called this moment the beginning of individuation, the sacred return to the authentic self. It is not a declaration made with fanfare, but a truth you begin to live, quietly, unshakably. Until now, perhaps you've measured your worth through their gaze, through how wanted you were, how approved, how needed. But when you awaken, when you no longer dance for affection or twist yourself for belonging, you realize the most radical act of self-love is to no longer beg for what should be sacredly mutual. This isn't detachment born from bitterness. It is not emotional coldness. Jung was clear. True detachment is psychological sovereignty. It is reclaiming the inner kingdom they tried to occupy. It's realizing your emotions are not currency to be traded for scraps of validation. When you no longer make yourself small to avoid their outburst, when you no longer absorb their shame as your duty, when your silence is no longer submission, but wisdom, then you are free. They can no longer reach you in the old ways. The strings they once pulled now dangle useless. Their charm, their rage, their guilt, they no longer command your center. And what terrifies them most is not your anger. It is your peace. Because your peace is proof. Proof that you were never theirs to control. Proof that love cannot be manipulated into fear. Proof that the one they tried to reduce has returned, not smaller, but whole. You stop being a character in their narrative. You become your own author. And in doing so, you begin to understand the full meaning of what Jung called the self, the integrated being who no longer depends on the reflection of others to feel real. You no longer perform, you simply are. And that, your being, whole and intact, is the one thing they cannot touch. There is a silence so powerful, it echoes louder than any scream. Not the silence of retreat nor of fear, but the silence of a soul that no longer needs to explain itself. Carl Jung taught us that the unconscious keeps perfect records. Long after the narcissist has rewritten history in their mind, cast you as the villain, framed themselves as the wounded, your calm, your quiet withdrawal remains etched in the depths of their psyche like an unanswered riddle. It unsettles them. You see, they expect fury. They expect tears, accusations, or desperate pleading. That's part of the game. Your chaos feeds their illusion of importance. But when you choose instead to simply walk away, without permission, without spectacle, without a final monologue, something ancient and terrifying stirs in them. Because for the narcissist, your absence becomes a mirror. And unlike before, this mirror doesn't reflect their grandiosity. It reflects a void, one they cannot fill, one they dare not face. Jung called this psychological tension, a split between the persona they wear and the truth buried deep within. When you leave with dignity, you become a fracture in their false self-image, a haunting they cannot name but cannot silence. They may scoff, they may mock, but at night, when no one is watching, when even their lies fall silent, your absence becomes unbearable. It seeps into their solitude, into their dreams, into the gaps between their overcompensation. And in those cracks, guilt begins to seep in. Not the conscious kind, but the raw, repressed type Jung described. Guilt as the psyche's attempt to restore balance. You did not scream. You did not fight. You chose peace, and that peace is their undoing. Because it leaves them with nothing to push against, no fight to win, no victim to blame. Just the truth, quietly standing in the space where you used to be, and that truth whispers, "You didn't break me," and that, to them, is unbearable. There comes a turning point, a quiet, inward moment, when you stop asking why they hurt you and begin asking, what inside me allowed it? That is the moment of true power, the beginning of integration. Carl Jung called this the work of the shadow, the sacred task of facing the parts of ourselves we have exiled, denied, and disowned, the rage we suppressed, the loneliness we buried, the hunger for love we camouflaged as strength. And when you choose to meet those parts with honesty, not judgment, you begin the real healing, not just of wounds, but of identity itself. You are no longer trying to be good enough for someone who refuses to see you. You are becoming real, not flawless, but whole. This is the path they will never walk. While you dive into the depths of your unconscious, braving the shadows, befriending your pain, making peace with your contradictions, they remain frozen in performance, trapped in what Jung called psychological inflation, a balloon of self-importance constantly at risk of bursting. They fear their own shadow. You are becoming one with yours. That difference is not just emotional, it is existential. Because shadow integration doesn't just make you stronger, it makes you clearer. It sharpens your boundaries. It ends the cycle of projection, where you confuse someone's manipulation for love. And here's what shakes them to the core. You no longer crave their apology. You no longer need closure. You've metabolized the pain into wisdom, turned heartbreak into discernment, transformed old wounds into new standards. And that evolution, that rising from within, that is what haunts them most. Because it means they never broke you. They merely triggered the awakening that would make you unstoppable. While they stay stuck, addicted to control, allergic to introspection, you walk forward into your future, eyes open, spirit intact. This is what they cannot imitate, and that is why your growth will always be their ghost. There is a silence more deafening than any scream. It's the silence of someone who no longer needs to explain themselves, who no longer justifies, begs, or tries to be understood. It's the silence of someone who has returned to themselves. Carl Jung called this psychological sovereignty, the state in which your inner authority outweighs every external demand, where your sense of self no longer relies on whether someone validates it or not. You become whole, not by adding more approval from others, but by withdrawing your power from those who never knew what to do with it. This is not coldness. It's clarity. This is not revenge. It's resurrection. And for the narcissist, it is intolerable. Because they fed not on who you truly are, but on your need to be seen, to be chosen, to be loved. And once that need dissolves, once you love yourself with the fullness you once reserved for them, their illusion of power shatters. They can no longer bait you. They can no longer guilt you. They can no longer manipulate a wound that no longer bleeds. Every step you take in peace becomes a step they cannot follow. Every boundary you set becomes a mirror to their own instability. And every breath of your freedom whispers the one truth they cannot bear to hear. You never needed them, not because you hardened your heart, but because you finally made it whole. And in this new wholeness, you are no longer someone they can harm. You are someone they will remember, not because you broke them, but because you stopped breaking yourself for them. You live now not to escape your pain, but to embody your truth. And that truth is untouchable. That truth is what will follow them, long after you've left the room, long after you've stopped speaking their name, long after they realize they were never the center of your story, only the catalyst for your liberation. There's a kind of fear that doesn't shout. It whispers, quiet, chilling, sacred. Carl Jung called it numinous fear, the terror that arises not from danger, but from truth. the kind of truth that strips away illusions, the kind that cannot be denied without consequences, the kind that doesn't just expose lies, but demands transformation. And you, your presence, your peace, your wholeness, are that truth. To the narcissist, your healing is not just inconvenient, it's intolerable, because it reveals, by its very existence, what they have refused to become. It is not what you say that disturbs them, it is what you are. You are living proof that integration is possible, that shadow work doesn't destroy, it refines. That pain doesn't end us, it births something more awake, more aware, more human. But for those who've built their lives on performance, such authenticity feels like death. You are the end of their illusion. You are the mirror they cannot distort. You are the flame that doesn't burn with anger, but with presence. And it haunts them. Every time you walk away with grace, every time you love without fear, every time you simply exist without needing their approval, you remind them that truth is not only real, but inevitable. They cannot kill what has resurrected itself from within. They cannot erase what has never been borrowed. You didn't just survive their storm. You became the sky they can never control. That is the fear, not of punishment, not of revenge, but of your existence as a symbol of what they could have been, had they dared to look within. And so, your light becomes their shadow, not because you seek to haunt them, but because you no longer need them to feel whole. And that, in its quiet majesty, is the most haunting revelation of all. You are simply living, breathing in peace, speaking only when moved by truth, no longer by pain, moving through life with quiet clarity, not to prove anything, but because you finally know who you are. And that, precisely that, is what haunts them. Because while they spiral in chaos, repeating the same manipulations, chasing the same hollow validation, you've chosen stillness. You've done the unthinkable. You've loved yourself completely, not as a performance, not as a mask, but as an act of radical truth. Carl Jung said that the greatest act of power is to accept oneself completely, not just the light, but the darkness too. And while they remain at war with their shadow, you have made peace with yours. That peace, it is unbearable for them, not because it harms them directly, but because it reflects back everything they could never become. You've become sovereign. They remain enslaved, chained to personas, driven by projections, terrified of silence. They see you, not chasing, not explaining, not returning, just being, fully, authentically. And in your being, they are undone, because you've done what they cannot. You've ended the cycle without seeking revenge. You've stepped out of their game, not with fury, but with freedom. And now their fantasy of control fractures every time your name echoes in memory, not through anger, but through indifference, not through confrontation, but through absence, and not by cursing them, but by blessing yourself. You are no longer the mirror, you are the truth. And that truth is not loud or cruel. It is still, it is whole, and it will follow them, not because you want it to, but because they cannot escape the gravity of someone who no longer needs them to feel complete. You have become untouchable, and that is the wound they cannot heal. In your daily life, this transformation may not look like a grand declaration, but rather a series of quiet, firm decisions, choosing to walk away from manipulation, refusing to explain your worth, setting a boundary and not apologizing for it. These are not small acts. They are acts of self-ownership, and they change everything. When you no longer allow someone else's chaos to determine your peace, you reclaim the most sacred territory there is, your inner world. You stop performing, you stop chasing, you stop rescuing people who are addicted to drowning, and in doing so, you return to yourself. Carl Jung didn't just speak of these ideas as theories, he lived them. He understood that wholeness was not perfection, but integration, that peace was not passive, but powerful, and that when you stop running from your shadow and start embracing your truth, you become someone no one can control, no one can define, and no one can use. If this message spoke to something deep inside you, if it helped you name something you felt but never articulated, then I invite you to stay with this journey. Subscribe to the channel to receive more Jungian insights that go beyond surface-level advice and speak to the soul. Share this video with someone who's ready to stop being defined by their wounds. And let me know in the comments, what part of your shadow are you finally ready to reclaim? This isn't just a video. It's a mirror, a map, a small invitation toward a larger liberation. Keep walking toward yourself. The most powerful version of you is waiting.